Welcome everybody to the afternoon meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners for November 10th, 2020. We have a couple of public works items and then some executive sessions this afternoon. I'm going to start with item 13A, and for the public that's watching, there are two different public hearings going on. So read carefully to know if you are here to make any public testimony on the two, and you'll have a time for whichever one you are most interested in. So 13A is the second reading and public hearing for ordinance number 20-09 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 15 roads to clarify roadway requirements and terminology, align the code with current policies, and adopt certain notification standards for roads and properties served by roads. And Order 20-11-10-04 in the matter of amending Lane Manual Chapter 15 roads to clarify roadway requirements and terminology, align the code with current policies, and adopt certain notification standards for roads and properties served by roads. And with us is Becky Taylor, Senior Transportation Planner. Becky, I will hand it off to you. I did not see necessarily a script, so prompt me when we are ready to open the public hearing.
Great. Thank you, Chair Buck and Commissioners. So this item is a second reading and public hearing and potential action on Ordinance 2009 to amend Lane Code Chapter 15 roads. There was a first reading and work session on this item on October 27th. This is a staff-initiated amendment package to modernize the code by clarifying terminology and affirming the intent of specific code provisions. With special thanks to Jim Cheney, County Council has reviewed the proposed amendments to ensure compliance with applicable law and policy. The proposed amendments also include a new requirement as directed by the board to increase property owner awareness of obligations that have been in place for years about maintenance responsibilities on local access roads by codifying notification requirements. This amendment package has been reviewed and refined by stakeholders and has been endorsed by the Transportation Advisory Committee and the Planning Commission. We have received no objections to the proposed amendments. Notice of the public hearing was published in the Register Guard, and no one has registered to comment today. Therefore, staff recommends approval of the ordinance as presented, and motions for your action today are included in your agenda packet.
Thank you. So just to ensure that we've had our public hearing and to ask the audience one more time, if there's anybody who wishes to speak on this matter, I'll open the public hearing and transfer it over to our moderator to confirm if there's any additional testimony.
Thank you, Chair Buck. At this time, if you have logged in or registered for the meeting to speak on this item, which is, sorry, I'm a little behind, which is the second reading and public hearing of Ordinance 2009 to amend Lane Code Chapter 15. If you have signed up to speak for that public hearing, please raise your virtual hand and I will call upon you to give your public testimony. I am not seeing any hands go up, so I believe I will turn it back over to you, Chair Buck.
Okay. If there's no further testimony, I'm just going to do a couple of technical asks of commissioners before we discuss or have questions or comments. Any disclosures of commissioners or abstentions due to conflicts of interest or bias?
I have none.
Chair, isn't
Yes,
this
sure.
Isn't this an ordinance and therefore requests of ex parte contacts is not appropriate request for, but the conflicts of interest would be appropriate. Is that correct?
I believe so. I'm kind of modifying a script here on this item.
Well, as always, I'd like to get on the record that if Mr. Malone is put something in the record of this, I would like to declare a potential conflict of interest in that Mr. Malone and I are in business, or we've been in business together, and he represents parties that may have placed items in the record, namely Land Watch, Lane County. And although our work has never involved Oregon land use law and does not involve Oregon land use law and does not involve any discussions of any thing before the Board of Commissioners, I just want to get that on the record. And I've also checked with the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, and they have stated that this is not a conflict under Oregon law, and I don't have to disclose it. The reason I am disclosing it is because Mr. Dingle and I have discussed this, and he recommended that I disclose it.
Very good. If there are no other disclosures, I'll close the public hearing, and we can move on to any questions or comments by commissioners. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. I would like to point out, at least from the script that was provided and all from staff, this appears to be a legislative matter of adopting code changes that are legislative, not land use oriented. So I don't know if we needed to really go through the whole ex parte contact with that. At least that's what appears from what staff has presented, that it's legislative. I have a question about the recording requirements for properties served by local access roads. This has been something we've talked about in the past. We've ran into an issue previously that we kind of ran afoul, I think, of state law when we wanted this to be a requirement on realtors to make this disclosure. Now what we're doing is switching it to the actual property owners to have to, I live on a local access road. So do I have to go in after we adopt this and and record this, or is it only once I want to sell my property I have to record this document? And maybe if legal counsel's on the line, they can answer the question about whether or not this runs afoul of some of the state restrictions on our ability to require some notifications on real estate transactions. I think earlier we had looked at doing that with some other issues relative to being close to quarry zone property a few years back. Commissioner Sorensen's probably the only one that remembers that. We inquired about the ability to require notification of sales of properties that are close to anything that has quarry zoning within so many feet. But so I guess my question is about that. When do you have to actually record this document, and have we run this past whether or not it runs afoul of any state prohibitions on mandates on real estate disclosure?
This is Jim Cheney. I'm in the line, and I drafted that language. So Becky, if I may respond to that. Yes, Commissioner Bozovich, Chair Bach, Commissioner Bozovich. Regarding that, this isn't a land use question. It's in our research on this, because it has to do with a characteristic of the access to the land and not a land use issue. This is not going to run afoul of those laws. Second, it does only occur when there is a transaction in the property. There's no requirement for it to occur in between. This is looking at the recording requirement as longer down the road. Right now, the immediate effect of this is going to be that on the Arlid site, the our people, and particularly Mike Coles, has been working with them. So this will appear on title reports just as a notation so that people get informed right now. However, long term, ARLID won't be here forever. ARLID is what we use right now for giving people notice, and we can commit to that in code that we can make that notice now. But for the long term, what's recorded against the property ultimately will be what's going to inform people in the future. So the combination of those two is there for that reason. And the sense of immediacy of needing this is less because we do have the ARLID answer right now.
Excellent. I just want to make sure that had been run up the flagpole, because I know when we tried to do the gravel mining notification, we got a big line of realtors in our offices telling us we shouldn't and couldn't do that. So a little surprised we weren't hearing from realtors on this one, but I guess it's because it's the seller making the notification and not the realtor. That's probably why. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I'm not seeing any, so I would entertain a motion to approve the second reading and public hearing of Ordinance 20-09 and Order 20-11-10-04 as presented.
So moved.
Second.
All right, moved by Commissioner Bozovich, second by Commissioner Farr. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 13B on our agenda, which is in the matter of, well, let me back up here. Fourth reading and public hearing for Ordinance 20-08 in the matter of amending Lane Code 16.244 Floodplain Combining Zone Rural Comprehensive Plan, LC 10.271 Floodplain Combining District for lands within the urban growth boundary, to modernize terminology and formatting, clarify review processes, and align the code more closely with state law and the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR Title 44, and adopting a savings and severability clause, file number 509-PA 20-05047. And yes.
Chair Buck, this is Diana, and I sincerely apologize for interrupting, but I need to take us back to Ordinance 2009. That vote needs to be a roll call vote.
I even circled it and highlighted it. Okay. Let's go back and do roll call. Mr. McCrysky.
Okay, can we just go ahead and do the roll call? You don't need to restate the motion.
Correct.
Okay.
Diana?
Commissioner Bozovich.
Aye.
Commissioner Sorensen. I saw an aye.
Aye
There we go, thank
again.
you. Commissioner Farr.
Aye.
Commissioner Burney.
Aye.
And Commissioner Buck.
Aye.
That's 5 ayes.
There we go. Technically correct. Thank you, Diana. All right. Now we'll move into 13B. And since I read the first paragraph, I'm going to go into the second paragraph, unless, Diana, you need to start again.
Chair Buck, if I may also just seek procedural clarification on the concurrent order to amend Lane Manual, Chapter 15, for consistency with that ordinance that was just passed. I believe that's a separate action. I'll ask Jim Cheney to weigh in.
Actually, sorry, this is Diana. I'm going to chime in again. We rolled them with an and the motion included both.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We're on ordinance 20-08. I read the first paragraph, and so I'll do the second paragraph, which also has an and. Order 20-08-18-13 in the matter of amending Chapter 11 of the Lane Manual to remove Section 11.020 flood hazard studies. And with us is Rachel Surslove, but I'll roll into the purpose and rules of the hearing before we have her come on. This is a continued public hearing. The date today is November 10th, 2020. The proposed Lane Code amendments are subject to the applicable criteria identified in Lane Code 12.005, 12.050, and 16.252 subsection 2, and applicable statewide planning goals. The order of proceedings for this hearing will first be the report by staff, followed by public testimony, and then additional comments by staff. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity to enable a response may preclude appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals on that issue. Prior to the conclusion of the public hearing, any participant may request that the record be left open to provide an opportunity to present additional written evidence or arguments regarding the application. The board's decision may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals in accordance with ORS Chapter 197. And at this time, I'll call for any disclosure of any commissioner abstentions due to conflicts of interest or bias. Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you so much. I wanted to place on the record the same potential conflict of interest I've added several other times, namely that Mr. Malone, who's a lawyer in Eugene, and I've had and continue to have business together at some minimal level, and that the Lane County Council's recommended that I make this disclosure. The Oregon Government Ethics Commission has said that I don't need to make the disclosure and don't have a conflict, but I'd like to place it on the record.
Thank you. Anybody else? I don't see any.
Chair Buck?
So I'll call for any challenges to the board's
Chair Buck?
Oh, yes, Commissioner Farr.
Sure. I'll state a potential conflict of interest in that I have visited properties adjacent to the Willamette and Mackenzie rivers that may be affected by this ordinance.
Very good.
Which we probably all have, but I'll
have
say
as
that.
well. Yep.
I have as well. I didn't know we had to call that out. Thank you.
All right. Are there any challenges to the board's qualifications to hear the matter? I hear none. So we'll go to the report by staff.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Commissioners. This is Rachel Surslove, Staff Planner for this project. And staff is here before you today for the fourth reading of the continued hearing for the Floodplain Code Modernization Project. Staff was last before you for a third reading and public hearing on October 6, 2020. As staff understands the board motion from the third reading, the board has requested more information on the possible flood insurance savings associated with a better community rating classification in the community rating system program that could be achieved if the higher regulatory standards were adopted by Lane County. And second, to revise the draft ordinance to prohibit new dwellings in the floodway, but to allow replacement of lawfully established dwellings in the floodway, and also to revise the draft ordinance to allow other development in the floodway. In the agenda cover memo, staff provides a general discussion of the community rating system and provides the prerequisites for becoming a Class 1 in the CRS program, which is the Community Rating Systems Program. It's a sub-program of the National Flood Insurance Program, and it allows Lane County to receive additional discounts for their community members who have flood insurance policies. While a Class 1 is not really achievable with the proposed amendments, a modification from Class 7, which is where Lane County is currently at, to a Class 6, which is a better class with more discounts, may be possible as a result of the amendments that are before you today. The agenda cover memo provides a table breaking down the points associated with each class in the community rating system, and each class is separated by at most 500 points, meaning if you have the least amount of points in one class, it would take at least 500 points to get you to the next class. As I said, currently Lane County is a Class 7 with 1,720 CRS points. And this means we would at least need 280 points in order to reach a Class 6. The memo also provides a table of the proposed higher regulatory standards and the maximum points possible associated with those standards through the CRS program. If the board adopts the higher regulatory standards, Lane County may receive additional CRS points for those standards, and those points may make it possible to be reclassified from a Class 7 to a Class 6. However, it should be noted that by adopting these provisions, full points are not guaranteed under the CRS program and may not result in a higher class. The process for modification of class involves submitting documentation of our permitting processes and our code to a CRS specialist, and that specialist goes through the possible points and looks at the information that we've submitted and determines what points we can be granted. Therefore, it's difficult for staff to forecast exactly what points can be gained if we're looking at moving up in a class. But it is something that we could apply for and pursue. I'll move on to the other parts of the motion from October 6th. The board also motioned for staff to revise the floodway provisions in the proposed ordinance, and specifically the motion aimed to allow replacement dwellings in the floodway and allow other non-structural development in the floodway. Staff has revised the proposed ordinance before you today to allow replacement of dwellings that were lawfully established in the floodway, either through a floodway development permit approved under the current code, or because the structure predates the flood insurance rate maps. The replacement dwelling is also required to be replaced in the same footprint. That's a criteria that we've included. The provisions also require that the dwelling be replaced in the floodway be existing. And to address the concerns of replacement dwellings for the Holiday Farm fire victims, the provision includes an exception for structures destroyed and no longer in existence due to the fire. Per the board's motion, the ordinance was also revised to include an exception to the floodway prohibition for other types of development, such as non-structural development. Based on public comment from sand and gravel industries, it appears that the floodway prohibition would be excessively prohibitive to the continued operation of those industries because operations are commonly conducted in the floodway. Therefore, staff have draft language that accepts quarry and mine extraction and related activities that are non-structural from the floodway prohibition. Much of the public comment that was received surrounding the October 6, 2020 reading has been, all of the comment received at that reading is provided with the agenda cover memo, and much of that comment regarded how the Holiday Farm fire victims would be affected by the floodway prohibition, and staff feels that the revised code before you today that allows replacement dwellings generally and specifically regarding the Holiday Farm fire addresses those concerns. Other comments received raised issues with ambiguity of the critical facilities definition and provision, and that it may have unintended consequences if adopted. The language presented to the board is suggested language from the Department of Land Conservation and Development Model Ordinance. But because this language is a higher regulatory standard, meaning that it doesn't have to be adopted as a minimum National Flood Insurance Program standard, we do have the latitude to revise that language. and customize it for Lane County, so long as it does not undermine any minimum standard of the NFIP. Therefore, the board may motion for staff to make revisions to this language, and that is a policy consideration for you today. Additional comments have been received after the publishing of the agenda cover memo for this reading, and that comment was provided as supplemental material to the board. Also, since the publishing of the staff memo, commissioners have requested additional information on the number of structures destroyed by the Holiday Farm fire that were located in the floodway and floodplain areas. Staff has recently received an updated damage assessment of those structures, and we were able to determine that there are actually 20 structures within the floodway area that were destroyed by the fire, and 146 within the floodplain area that were destroyed by the fire. And unfortunately, this data is not granular enough for us to determine if these structures were dwellings or simply accessory structures. So some of the structures included in this count could be things like garages or shops and are not necessarily dwellings. That's just something I wanted to note about those numbers. And because we do have this updated damage assessment information, our previous estimate of only 5 dwellings or so being in the floodway is actually incorrect. And it looks like it's closer to 20 structures within the floodway that were affected by the fire. And that concludes my staff report, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Chair Buck.
Thank you. We will move on to public testimony at this time. So the public that is viewing and watching with us, if you are interested in providing public testimony, raise your hand icon on your device, and I will transfer this to our moderator.
Thank you, Chair Buck. At this time, if you are calling in to give public testimony on ordinance number 20-08, please raise your hand. I will call upon you, and when I call upon you, I will unmute your microphone and start the timer, and you may begin your public testimony. The first person I have is Sam Norgard-Stoik. I will unmute you, and you may begin your public comment.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Sam Norgard-Stoik. I'd like to add public testimony, especially focusing on LC 16.244 and for further protection of our river systems, specifically floodways and floodplains, with recognition that as we protect these natural processes, we also protect people who live in those areas, first responders will be asked to rescue those people in those areas, and taxpayers that ultimately have to pay for rescue efforts and recovery packages. Please work to increase protection of the natural flooding processes of our rivers, including the floodways especially, and also the floodplains. Today, my comments are from a personal perspective and not from any organization I represent, but I have lived and worked in Lane County for only about 25 years, but during that time, I've been a commercial guide along the Mackenzie, Willamette, and Siuslaw rivers. I currently work for the U of O outdoor program where we have guided trips in the river floodplain regularly. I'm also on the Willamette Natural Area Committee, which is entirely within the historical floodplain of the Willamette River, and the co-founder of the Willamette River Festival, designed to celebrate the Willamette River floodplain, focusing on the Canoe Canal, which was a historic side channel, and the main river channel. My experiences have shown me extensive construction, including new construction, right up to the river's edge during low water and summer flows. As someone who has studied fluvial geomorphology, it always surprises me we don't have more problems than we currently do protecting people and our natural systems. I agree with the first section of LC 16-244 regarding floodplain protections, specifically the purpose to promote the public health, safety, and general welfare, and to minimize public and private losses due to flood conditions in the Pacific areas. That was a specific quote. I'm concerned about several sensitive species, some examples including spring Chinook salmon and other salmonids, freshwater mussels that we have just started to learn about. And these are just 2 examples of the importance of side channel rearing habitat that occurs in the floodplain. I'm also concerned about natural system processes as well. Large rivers, as we all know, such as the Mackenzie, Willamette, and Isla, are meant to wander. As we continue to develop the floodplain, we continue to make protections to these developments, such as channelization efforts, trying to keep the river within its channel. We all know that this increases the flooding downstream. But also, if we enable the river to access its upstream natural floodplain naturally, this slows flooding downstream by absorbing waters and releasing runoff slowly. And we ain't seen nothing yet. The historic floods of the Willamette Valley are huge compared to what we've been experiencing. Thank you for your work to continue to protect the floodplain and the floodway.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker will be Lisa Arkin, and I will follow Lisa with Michael Gillardi. Lisa, I will unmute you and you may begin your public comment.
Can you hear me? My name is Lisa Arkin, and I am in Commissioner Sorensen's district. And I'm testifying today to ask for updates or amendments to the floodplain combining zone. According to the Lane Management Division Planning Staff report dated July of this year, your own staff warned that the floodway is an extremely hazardous area due to the velocity of floodwaters that carry debris, potential projectiles, and high erosion potential. And for this reason, speaking as a representative of our community and Beyond Toxics, we recommend needed restrictions on new development and hardscaping, as well as regulatory management of excessive fellings and toxic materials in Lane County's flood zone. The point is that our public health and safety are at risk. And from the standpoint of your role as the Lane County Board of Health, there's an obligation to adopt regulations to prevent hazardous materials from rushing into flood waters, which will cause debris, projectiles, and structures in the floodplain, causing significant downstream public health risks. Biopersistent chemicals, heavy metals, asbestos, and other hazardous materials would pose a safety risk for the folks downstream. And we should protect not only our downstream neighbors along the Willamette River, as our own communities. For the reasons above, Beyond Toxic supports a prohibition on building new structures in the floodway, and a prohibition on small accessory structures used to store things like chemicals, gas cans, fertilizers, used tires, old cars, farm equipment, fuel, etc. FEMA encourages communities to enact prohibitions of development and structures in the floodplain, and floodplain development is discouraged for the reasons that placing structures or storing materials in the floodplain is a public health and safety risk. So in conclusion, we recommend that the Board of Commissioners adopt ordinance language that prohibits new structures in the floodway, requires relocation of existing accessory structures unless the resident can demonstrate that no alternative location above the floodplain exists, immediately prohibit storage of chemicals, vehicles, and equipment in the floodway, and adopt monitoring and regulatory procedures, as well as require septic fields in new construction to be built away from the floodway. We understand that homes did burn in the holiday fires, so we hope that these folks are able to build again and build in such a way that it is not impacting our floodway. Thank you for the opportunity to give comment.
Thank you for your public comment. At this time, I do see there are a lot of people signed in, but they have not entered their PIN to speak, so I'm unable to unmute you. I will call next upon Tom Bauerman to speak. Yes, you just went away, Mr. Bellman. Looks like you just put your hand down. Mr. Bauerman, did you want to speak? If so, will you please raise your hand again? Everyone who has not entered their PIN, I will send you a PIN number. So if you see a thing come up on your screen, it will be me sending you the PIN. And it doesn't look like my timer is working anymore. Our next speaker will be Jennifer Eisel. Jennifer, I will unmute you and I will begin the timer if I can get it working again. Jennifer, I'm unmuting you. And I show you are self-muted.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? My name is Jennifer Isla. I live in Springfield. I am Western Shoshone and Northern Paiute. I'm here today to comment on the proposed revisions to the floodplain code LC 16244 and 10.271. My comments submitted are my personal views as a community member. The Willamette and the Mackenzie River system supports a variety of native fish species that have sustained indigenous people since time immemorial. The Upper Willamette River, the Mackenzie River, and tributaries throughout Lane County support native fish populations, including steelhead, rainbow, cutthroat, and our spawning grounds for Chinook and coho salmon. Native fish are critical biological indicator species dependent on healthy waterways in order to maintain native fish populations. It is critical to implement better stewardship practices to limit increased degradation to water quality and fish habitat in the Upper Willamette and the Mackenzie River. On November 5th, 2020, an article was published by the Statesman Journal, which states Oregon DEQ identifies hundreds of toxins in the Willamette River Basin, water, soil, and fish. The article includes DEQ's Willamette River Basin Water Toxic Summary, which details the results of water quality sediment and tissue sampling conducted in 2016. It tested for 460 chemicals, of which 318 were detected, including current use and legacy pesticides, consumer use products, combustion byproducts, dioxins, and furans, flame retardants, industrial chemicals, PCPs, and metals. The Mackenzie River contributes roughly 30% of streamflow volume to the Upper Willamette River. I am asking the Board of Commissioners to consider the importance of protecting critical fish habitat. Please revise the floodplain code to include language that includes protections for our waterways from increased post-fire stormwater runoff and highly probable flood scenarios where hazardous and toxic materials in the floodway would enter the Mackenzie River. I urge the Board of Commissioners to include the following language: to prohibit new development structures in the floodway of any river or stream except for replacement of existing structures that burned in the holiday farm fire, immediately prohibit the storage of fuels, chemicals, vehicles, and equipment in the floodway, and adopt monitoring and regulatory procedures, place all septic fields uphill from new and replacement construction of homes in the floodway using the septic system, and smart move to protect river from human waste in case of flooding or septic failure. We can all be better stewards of the river. Protecting the Mackenzie River is water quality through stronger ordinance language is a way to support and show respect for cultural traditions of Oregon's indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. I will now call on Michael Gillardi. I'm unmuting you and I will begin your timer. One moment, let me start the time, get a new timer set, and you may begin your public comment.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. My name is Michael Gillardi from Gillard. For the record, my address is P.O. Box 8529 in Coburg, 97408. My comments this afternoon are a follow-up to my testimony from last month about the critical facilities definition. As you may recall, I described this as a technical issue, some widespread unintended consequences in this ordinance. I was disappointed to see that there have been no changes proposed to that definition in the new draft. As Ms. Surslev said at the beginning of this hearing, the county has authority to do this, and the staff are characterizing this as a policy question. But what I want to emphasize is that there's a really significant legal issue here, which has to do with the limits of the county's authority to regulate protected natural resource uses throughout the floodplain. There's a wide range of uses that are that occur in the floodplain and are protected by state law, including things like gravel mining, agricultural buildings, crop processing facilities. And the proposed rules could restrict or prohibit these, both, the rules on their face as well as various ways in which they could be implemented over time. So I urge you to fix this. Really concerned about the volume and the nature of land use litigation in the county. I ran the numbers recently, and over the last 4 years, there have been land use appeals out of Lane County than any in the state. There's almost twice as many appeals coming out of Lane County as out of the state, and significantly more than out of any other county. And so it's incumbent on the commission to make defensible land use decisions. I see this ordinance as proposed, for example, of a decision that if it's not rectified could lead to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of litigation. And so I urge you to take a step back, think these issues through before moving forward with this ordinance. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker will be Hayley K Scott. Hayley, I will unmute you and you may begin your public comment as soon as I get the timer started. Hayley, I show you are self-muted.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Alrighty, so hello Board of Commissioners, this is Hayley K Scott again, and I'm the Climate Justice Grassroots Organizer for Beyond Toxics and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Eugene Springfield, Oregon, Unit number 1119. I am a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and a descendant of the Klamath Tribes, Yurok Tribes, and Sokogan Band of Chippewa. And I am also a resident of Springfield with my mother and 2 younger siblings. I'm also an appointed member of the county's Climate Advisory Committee that was recently established to provide recommendations to the Board and Public Works Department Climate Action Plan development. I'm here today to comment on Ordinance number 20-08 in the matter of amending the floodplain combining zone. I am testifying today to urge the Board of Commissioners to take additional measures to protect the Mackenzie River. The Holiday Farm Fire left behind an accumulation of toxic materials, including asbestos, mercury, and other dangerous substances. In fact, the exposure hazard is so substantial, the Oregon Health Authority issued health and safety warnings that returning residents refrain from touching the ash and soil on their property due to the possibility of toxic exposure. The wildfire is a vivid example of how, in the case of either flood or fire, or potentially both as we move into winter weather patterns, biopersistent chemicals, heavy metals, asbestos, and other hazardous substances would pose a public health and safety risk for drinking water as well as irrigation water used to grow food. The river is the drinking water source fulfilling the water needs of about 200,000 people in Lane County. I urge the Board to adopt amendments to the proposed draft ordinance with the adoption of model ordinance language that protects our communities from increased hazards of flooding association with construction, hardscaping, and exposures to hazardous and toxic materials in floodwaters. Specifically, I urge the Board consider the following: to prohibit new development structures in the floodway of any river or stream except for replacement of existing structures that burned in the Holiday Farm Fire if another site can't be built upon. To immediately prohibit the storage of fuels, chemicals, pesticides, vehicles, and equipment in the floodway and adopt monitoring and regulatory procedures. To place all septic fields uphill from new and replacement construction of homes in the floodway. This is feasible using a septic pump, which is a smart move to protect the river from human waste in the case of flooding or septic field failure. We can take these steps to protect the water that so many of us depend on to live healthy and happy lives. In times such as the current public health crisis and aftermath of the devastating fires, we need clean water more than ever. So thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker will be Kelly Wood. Kelly, I will reset the timer in 1 second and then you may begin your public comment. 1 moment. Let me let this run out just real quick. It's faster this way. And Kelly, you may begin your public comment.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Wood and I'm here representing Wildish Sand and Gravel. I'm participating today to request that the Board of County Commissioners please include a discussion of the proposed compensatory storage code during today's hearing. The compensatory storage code is one of the most complex sections of the proposed floodplain code updates and the topic that the Planning Commission spent the most time discussing. It is important to acknowledge that the Planning Commission recommended this section be omitted from the Lane County Code. However, because the board requested higher standards be drafted, the planning staff opted to leave the language in for consideration. As it's currently written, this code will undoubtedly and unintentionally prohibit construction and development in some areas of the floodplain. Therefore, it is essential that this code not be adopted. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker is Alexis Little. Alexis, I will unmute you and you may begin your public comment.
Hi there. Thank you. Again, thank you, commissioners, for allowing me to address you twice in one day. It's a rare opportunity. My name is Alexis Little, representing 1000 Friends of Oregon. I want to start off by just stating that we strongly support the right to rebuild any dwelling that was destroyed in the Holiday Farm fire. I think that everyone agrees on that. And I also would like to add that the amendments for non-structural activities is also something that we agree with for those amendments. And a lot of the points that have been mentioned before were said in a more articulate way than I would ever say it. I'm not going to repeat a lot of the points that were made, though I agree with many of the ones concerning protection of natural resources and keeping people out of harm's way as much as possible. From a legal view, both the U.S. Supreme Court and Oregon law support legitimate public safety measures as exempt from federal takings laws. And I want to just kind of tie a thread through a lot of the things that were said in a lot of the comments prior to me, and that many of them relate directly to public safety in a very legitimate way, where we're banning development in the dangerous portion of a flood where everything is wiped out and the people are really in the middle of harm's way. And that this amendment will definitely respect that federal takings law. And like I said, many of the people before me have stated these points well, so I think you all understand the environmental benefits of doing this. So thank you for your time, and appreciate you listening to me twice today. Have a good one.
Thank you for your public comments. Our next speaker will be Mackenzie Bauerman. Before I unmute you, I also want to let Lori Siegel-Locker know. I do see you have your hand raised, but I am unable to mute you. I have sent you a PIN number that I'm going to need you to enter. Mackenzie, let me reset the clock and I will unmute you and you may begin your public comment.
Hi, am I coming through? Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Mackenzie Bauerman, 532 Olive Street, Eugene. I am here to recognize and support your work in the improved floodplain code. Specifically, I'm here in favor to prohibit most new development within the floodway. The floodway, with the high velocity discharge waters during a 100-year flood, is a particularly dangerous place to build. Further, I also respect a right to replace existing dwellings. Water under the bridge, if you will. I believe that planning laws are meant to allow thoughtful growth and development in an orderly way. This thoughtful development can help us avoid precarious situations that come in the wake of predictable natural disasters like floods. To seek to improve planning laws is not a city dweller environmentalist land grab, in my opinion. I am a lifelong Oregon resident, spending most of it in rural Lane County. I see planning as a way to maintain our quality of life, protect public safety, and preserve land and water for future generations and uses. We impose a reasonable burden on the few to protect the rights of the many. For the same reasons, we do not allow industrial uses in residential zones. I own land of which a portion is located within the floodway. I would not consider building within that area as I consider it to be part of the active river, and that it would be reckless to do so. I have watched the Mackenzie and the Willamette rivers flood several times in my life. Ordinary floods are an awesome thing to observe, with whole trees and churning waters. Extraordinary floods are scary. I remember the flood of 1996 and the Matthews house near Cedar Flat. It was undercut by the river. The property owners lost everything, and no jurisdiction stepped forward to prevent it from falling into the river. Eventually, though, local river stewards organized funds to remove the condemned house, but already the septic system and accessory structures had already washed downstream. Losses like these are preventable. Well, lastly, my heart goes out to those impacted by the fires. It has directly impacted friends and family, and I don't want to add to their challenges, and I pledge to support them in this difficult time. Thank you for this opportunity to share my views, and good day.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker is Lori Siegel-Walker. Lori, and let me reset the timer and you may begin your public comment. One moment. Faster to let 8 seconds go by. You may begin your public comment, Lori.
Thank you. Hello, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Today, I'm speaking on behalf of both Landwashed Lane County and myself. I am speaking to urge you to consider the implications of the Lane Code 16244 floodplain amendments in a broad rather than a narrow context. This includes considering the effect of fire and erosion as you consider how to build back after the most recent local natural disaster. The Holiday Farm fire should be a wake-up call. It was not a fluke, and it was not an example of the only natural disasters our communities are vulnerable to. We have overbuilt, overcleared, and overlogged our lower elevation forested lands and riparian areas, and doing so inevitably comes with risks and consequences. Human beings' long-held belief that we can contain or at least control Mother Nature is not based on reality. For example, Landwatch hears time and time again in response to requests for dwellings in the forest zone that roads can serve as adequate secondary fuel breaks where the subject property itself is too small to include the required 100-foot secondary fuel break. It appears the Holiday Farm fire did not get that memo. County planners are consistently pressed to accept development site plans which do not include adequate fuel breaks around dwellings and structures or adequate setbacks from Class 1 streams, the only streams that appear to matter for some reason. One of the primary reasons for this problem is small, even tiny-sized tax lots. Not only are the tax lots along Highway 126 and adjacent to the Mackenzie River small, even tiny, there are hundreds of tax lots located in areas not adjacent to a county road, zoned forest, and approved for or developed with dwellings that are less than 5 acres in size. Building back should include improving over what was less than optimal rather than perpetuating the long-held myth that somehow we will defy nature with some new tactic. Building back should also include consideration of the likely erosion that will result, more fires, and of course, flood events. Please consider these recommendations. No new dwellings should be permitted in the floodway. Replacement dwellings and structures that were lawfully permitted and located in the floodway and lost in the fire should be restricted to the same footprint with financial incentives offered for smaller footprints. Include and incentivize an option to rebuild on higher ground if possible. The availability of high-tech mapping software should make it possible to enact this kind of provision without much difficulty. And finally, please provide an inventory of the map numbers that lost the homes and structures, including the zoning. This inventory could help the public, planners, and elected officials understand what was lost and where, and inform policy decisions moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. If you're there, are there any additional
Sorry, was speaking with mute on. At this time, I show that there are no more hands raised. If you would like to give additional public comment, please raise your hand if you have not done so already. Let me take a look. I see Mr. Bauerman, I see you raising your hand but putting it down. If you would like to give public comment, will you please raise your hand and I will unmute you? Okay, Mr. Bauerman, I'm going to unmute you and you begin the timer. If you do not wish to give public comment, we'll just move forward. Thanks. You are unmuted and may begin your public comment if you would like.
Yes, thank you. I have my hand up and you didn't, something happened way a long time ago, but my hand has been up. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Bauerman. I live on 33707 Mackenzie View. I can tepidly support the adoption of this ordinance in its fourth reading version, but I think it can be quite a bit better. If you move for further amendments, I urge you include three key elements consistent with Deschutes County's floodplain zone ordinance. A of these three, the first of these three is the third reading provided that natural hazard redevelopment in the floodway required that the same footprint, but could be relocated or has to be relocated to higher ground if the parcel had higher ground. I'm puzzled that the reading was changed because I did not hear or see a Board of Commissioners motion or order to remove this provision. I would recommend that the third reading version be reestablished so that the high ground provision is returned. This is in the Deschutes Code, by the way. Number two, general floodplain, which is compared to the floodway. In the general floodplain, also apply the higher ground rule so that when development of a parcel occurs, the person's required to seek the high ground if it's available on that parcel. And C, do not allow new subdivisions or parcels within the floodplain which allow for additional residential dwellings. I'm just sort of doing a hack, trying to simplify the Deschutes Code, but in the two prior written testimony, I put the explicit language in the Deschutes Code, which I think is exemplary in quite short. George Greer isn't testifying, but I want to read quickly something that he said. I want to recognize the extraordinary efforts the board has made to accommodate the recovery of our fire-stricken communities in this process, and then allow them to rebuild. Advocacy and compassion are critical to their future. But it's important to recognize that the future is also determined by the health of our rivers. Without a healthy river, redevelopment and economic recovery will suffer. So in the midst of the suffering, who will speak for the river? I'd like you to recall Jeff Ziller's previous testimony as a fish biologist for 30 years. He has witnessed the dramatic decline of the flood functions. The changes that are proposed here are moderate but important, and please listen to the river. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your public comment. That is the last hand I see raised. I will call one more time for anyone else who might like to give public comment to raise your hand. Oh, looks like I saw one hand go up, but then it went down. Robert Emmons, if you would like to speak, would you please raise your hand? I think I saw your hand go up. Okay. Only press the button once, because every time you press it, it puts it up and down, and it's hard to tell what you want to do. I'm going to unmute you, and I will start your timer, and you may begin speaking, Robert.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, commissioners. Robert Emmons here, 40093 Little Fall Creek Road in Fall Creek. I'm going to offer the following comments on behalf of Landwatch Lane County and on myself, for myself. First, let me just say, we certainly wholeheartedly support, and I'm echoing other comments here, disallowing new dwellings in the floodway. and trust that, as the staff report said, that for those dwellings and structures in the floodway lost in the fire, that replacement will be confined to the same footprint and even encouraged to be smaller for whatever incentive might be available. However, I want to echo Mr. Bauerman's concern about being perplexed by staff's removal of the requirement to replace on higher ground if feasible, because somehow the language is subjective. I don't think this was directed by the board. You may correct me if that's untrue, but certainly the use of topographical maps and LIDAR would objectify any concerns about the location of higher ground on a property. As in Deschutes County, insightful legislation would also apply the higher ground requirement to the entire floodplain. Truth appears to be, unfortunately, that people are demanding to put their home in the most desired, not the safest location, regardless of risk to themselves and others and its impacts on the environment. More importantly, though, both this update and the crisis provide a broader opportunity to bring together a coalition of professionals, experts, and stakeholders to craft comprehensive legislation that would recognize and protect the symbiotic relationship of floodplains, riparian zones, and upland areas as a matter of public health and safety. Comprehensive floodplain regulation would include a prohibition of building in the floodplain and a strengthened and enforced riparian ordinance with habitations and other structures kept as far as possible from the high water mark of waterways and native vegetation left intact. To avoid landslides, sedimentation, and pollution from toxic sprays, among other benefits, the practice of clear cutting must end. The Mackenzie I saw on a 12-mile raft trip just the week before the fire is a dying river infected by a rapidly spreading pandemic of intrusive and abusive development that has removed native vegetation necessary for river protection and the wildlife in and along it, and whose herbicides, fertilizers, and failed septics have created extensive algae blooms and other toxins that threaten endangered salmon and Eugene's water source. Floodway protection of people and property should be just the first step to what Jeff Ziller, biologist with ODF&W, has described as a strategic and informed approach to recovery based on science. The necessary measures to resuscitate our ailing watersheds will, of course, take time and the willingness to undertake them, but the commitment should be considered an emergency. Landwatch Lane County continues to be a willing and steadfast participant in that recovery. Thank you very much for holding this hearing and for all your consideration.
Thank you for your public comments. I do have one more person, George Greer. I believe you would like to give public comment. I did see your comment. I will unmute you when I will begin the timer and you may begin your public testimony. You are self-muted.
Oh, I'm on.
There you go.
My name is George. I've lived at 1342 and a half 66th Street in Springfield for over 45 years. My property is within and adjacent to the floodplain and floodway of the Mackenzie River and Cedar Creek. The National Flood Insurance Program and its floodplain code stayed relatively unchanged until a few years ago. The code was put in place to provide a uniform set of standards to manage the risk pool. The NFIP is the only realistic alternative for people who need flood insurance. As losses mounted for the NFIP from storms like Katrina, things changed. Premiums rose dramatically and the code was re-examined with an eye toward limiting future losses to the pool by encouraging communities to adopt things like raising new development above the base flood elevation. There's been a growing realization that best practices for life, safety, and property losses often amount to simply staying out of the way of the river. The days of massive levee projects are over. In the Northwest, the Seattle area was first to dramatically alter its code. Those reforms have worked their way into other jurisdictions and finally made it to Lane County. It's ironic that the code amendments that have raised the most controversy are those that have the most potential for cost savings on flood insurance and that are the best for the health of the river. There's absolutely no question that development in the floodway is bad for the river through altered flow regimes. Experience has shown that residential development in the floodway often creates problems. In many instances, landowners come back to the county to request fill permits to protect these structures. This often results in redirected high-velocity floodwaters. None of this is good for the health of the river. So, after almost 2 years in this process, here we are. I want to recognize the extraordinary efforts the board has made to accommodate the recovery of our fire-stricken communities in this process and allow them to rebuild. Advocacy and compassion are critical to their future, but it is important to recognize that their future is also determined by the health of our rivers. Without a healthy river, redevelopment and economic recovery will suffer. So in the midst of this suffering, who will speak for the river? I'd like you to recall Jeff Ziller's previous testimony, where as fish district biologist for 30 years, he's witnessed the dramatic decline of critical species and habitat through the slow death of our rivers because of floodplain development. The changes that are proposed here are moderate but important. They will not impact recovery. Please listen to the river. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. I do not see any more hands raised or anyone else wishing to give public testimony or comment at this time. So Chair Buck, I will return the meeting to you.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for testifying. I'll move back to any additional comments by staff at this point.
Thank you, Chair Buck. I do have a few additional comments in regards to the public comments regarding the critical facilities provision. The board did not provide any guidance or direction to revise that language on October 6th, but if the board would like that language to be revised, or if you would like staff to look into the new Goal 5 question that has been raised in relation to the critical facilities provision, we would be happy to do that. And then I'd also like to provide clarification regarding the floodway prohibition and replacement dwelling changes. Some of the public comment raised questions about why the provision for moving replacement dwellings to higher ground was removed. The board did generally motion for staff to revise the replacement dwelling provision for development in the floodway, and the board didn't specifically identify what criteria for replacement dwellings should be written into the code. So staff did remove the provision that required replacement dwellings be located outside of the floodway where possible, due to some concerns that we heard from the board regarding the subjectivity of the practicable and feasible language that was proposed. So it's not really an issue of the LIDAR or topography or where the higher ground is. That's not the subjective part of the provision. The subjective part would be where is the practicable and feasible location outside of the floodway to replace the dwelling. So that was removed, but if the board wishes to provide more direction on exactly what criteria should be included for replacement dwellings, then staff would be happy to further revise the ordinance. And then one thing I did not mention in my initial staff report was that staff's recommendation today is for the board to approve the fourth reading of the ordinance and set the 5th and final reading for December 1st. And we also recommend closing the public hearing. And that's all I have for response.
Thank you. I'm not going to close the public hearing yet unless we decide as a board we want to do that. So I want to provide some opportunity for the board to speak. And if we as a board want to close the public hearing, we can. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. I'm probably going to need more than one round to get through all of this because there is so much complexity in this. I want to start with just affirming my support for the prohibition of new dwellings in the floodway. I've never been against that particular part of the code. I wanted to just get some things fixed in it, and I think that the exceptions now do a good job of fixing that. I will say though, under Little Roman numeral 4 floodway, AAA, Little Roman numeral 3, the exception mentions the date of the fire. It has the date wrong. at least in what was supplied in the board materials. I don't think the fire started on September 1st. So just something that might need to be a little bit of, if there is a motion, make sure that there's, that little error gets corrected. I think it was a little bit later than that, by about a week. So other than that, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm just going to start with talking about freeboard and this idea about getting into the next level of 5% of additional cost savings in flood insurance premiums. One of the things the staff memo makes an error in is it fails to subtract points for what we're already doing. It counts a full 250 points for the 2 foot of freeboard and the compensatory fill requirement. It does not subtract the 100 points for the 1 foot of freeboard we already require. And it does that in several other places. So the staff's 690 points or whatever they show there in the staff memo is not accurate. And we would need to go through with FEMA and judge where we already have the 1720 points we already have includes a lot of what we already require. And we are not doing the bare minimum here in Lane County. We already require 1 foot of freeboard. And this is really important when it comes to floodplain development. And this is really important to the Holiday Farm fire victims and across the rest of the county, because that additional foot of freeboard, according to estimates I've gotten from the home builders for a 1,500 square foot home, is somewhere between $5,000 to $10,000 in additional cost. So as we were talking about last week in our public health meeting and the need for affordable housing, just remember that extra foot of freeboard we're looking to add in our code is an extra $5,000 to $10,000 on the cost of a home, which also means if it's required of fire victims, it's an extra $5,000 to $10,000 for fire victims rebuilding. And I submitted some evidence to be placed in the record yesterday that has graphics that show 3 panels of our floodway maps and our fire damage assessment maps. And I don't know if you guys want to pull that up if you can, but what it points out is the floodway issue, even though there's somewhere between 5 and 20 structures that might be in the floodway that we have an exception for redevelopment, there's probably well over 100 or so structures that were completely destroyed in the floodplain. So that extra foot of freeboard is going to add that $5,000 to $10,000 of cost to all of those structures. And as you go down those panels, the first one starts up at the Holiday Farm RV Park and works its way down river. I did not do the entire river because it's a lot of work to get those matched up exactly and bring them into Photoshop and clip them and put them in a PowerPoint. But if you look at the last panel, it gets down to Blue River. And if you notice, the town of Blue River is almost entirely covered with floodplain. I'm trying to be really careful about saying those 2 words because they're 2 very different things. And as most of our public testimony testified, floodway is a dangerous place. Floodplain can be less than a few inches deep and almost no velocity of water once every 100 years. One of the things I also included with my written testimony that I put into the record yesterday was copies of the FEMA flood profiles for that same reach of Mackenzie River, from Blue River on up to Mill Creek. And if you look at those profiles, the top line is the 500-year flood. The next line down that's long with a single short dash and long again is the 100-year. And those grids on there, each grid square vertically is a foot. And the difference between those two lines is somewhere between 1 foot to 2 feet, depending on where you are in that reach. So we're already building 1 feet above the 100-year floodplain in our code, which puts a lot of that area at the 500-year flood elevation. So adding an extra foot to that is having people build above the 500-year flood elevation, which to me is hard to justify as a life and health safety issue, which gets us back into the issue of possible takings. Because if we're already 1 foot over, and in this particular stretch of the river puts you at 500 year for the most part, or darn close to it, going another foot puts you above the 500 year. So I want, folks keep that in mind, and then look at Blue River and think about how small those lots are, which gets us into the problem of compensatory fill, which in our language requires that the compensating has to be done on the same parcel of land. So if we have to fill an extra foot for those homes in Blue River, they have to find compensatory storage on the same lot. So we, just something to be very careful of, and why this is so complex, and something we shouldn't just knee-jerk jump into. But I want to just, I'll stick with just the issue of the extra foot of freeboard for right now. I've got other issues with critical facilities, and a few other issues, around writing exceptions that we have to be careful about in savings and severability clauses, cost, and other issues. But just for right now, I want you to think about looking at those flood profiles, whether an extra foot that might save somebody 5% on their flood insurance, which is not a lot of money, but might add $5,000 to $10,000 on the cost of a house. Is that truly a life and health safety regulation? And is it going to get us anything in the way of that credit, in knowing that we already elevate a foot? So I would propose that we drop back to what we originally had in our code, which is base flood elevation plus 1 foot or 2 feet above existing ground, as our previous code was, rather than the base flood of elevation plus 2 feet. And I'll talk about critical facilities in the next round, but I just want the board to seriously think about whether they want to keep that 2 foot requirement in there. I believe, after looking carefully at flood profiles, that it's really an excessive requirement.
Is there another commissioner that would like to speak? Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that the testimony on this has been quite different than our previous testimony, in that we've made it very clear in this draft that homes, and specifically dwellings, can be rebuilt in the floodway on the same footprint. And I wanted to ask Ms. Surslev a question about the latter half of my statement there. It's clear that people that have had homes in the floodway who wish to rebuild them, I believe you said that was 20 in the Mackenzie River area. Are they allowed to build a larger structure, or are they only allowed to build on the same footprint?
If they are replacing in the floodway, then they would be restricted to the same footprint of the structure being replaced.
Can you comment on the testimony that said within the floodway, when there are alternatives to build on higher ground, that should be a component of our ordinance, And is it or is not part of the current ordinance? And is it or is not part of the Deschutes County ordinance?
It is not part of the current ordinance. It was previously a criteria that staff had drafted into replacement dwelling language that required, if feasible and practicable, the dwelling being replaced in the floodway be replaced outside of the floodway if there was a suitable location. That's not currently in the current ordinance. And I can't speak to the Deschutes code, as I haven't looked specifically for that piece of language in their code.
Okay. What about the floodplain higher ground rule, so-called higher ground rule for the floodplain?
There is no standard that requires a replacement dwelling to be located on higher ground when replacing in the floodplain.
Okay, and that's not currently in this draft.
That's correct.
Okay. And finally, what about the restriction on the subdivisions in the floodplain as apparently is in the Deschutes code?
Again, I haven't looked specifically at the Deschutes code regarding the subdivision standards. I know that the code before you prevents subdivisions from creating lots that are entirely in the floodway. I don't believe there are standards related to creating lots in the floodplain, but I would have to reference the ordinance.
Okay. Well, I think that we should have some more discussion at the board level, but it seems like those would be improvements if we could have another reading, and those could be improvements to this proposal. But I think there are other commissioners that may wish to speak before I make a motion. Thank you.
Is there another commissioner who would like to speak? I'll add a few thoughts until other people are interested in speaking more. I do support the higher ground option if it can be defined, specifically defined. I believe in one of the testimony of Deschutes, which staff would have to verify, some of the language says no new construction of a dwelling, including manufactured housing, accessory structure, or farm use structure shall be located in the floodplain unless it can be demonstrated by the applicant that no alternative exists on the subject property, which would allow the structure to be placed outside of the floodplain. And that is specific to the floodplain, but in the floodway, it would make sense that they be placed in a higher ground option that I think could be mathematically calculated if it can be specific enough to withstand somebody challenging it. And I'm not sure if the language that you had presented the previous time could do that, but that question I know did come up. I did look over the information that Commissioner Bozovich provided, because I also wanted to understand the differences and how many people were affected. I appreciate that information. I noticed in the elevation graphic that the differences started somewhere between 1, but went up to 3 in some areas of feet in difference, depending on stream distance. And so the extra elevation, extra foot of elevation requirement could still make a big difference if people were in the 2 to 3 feet section of that, which was a good chunk of the graphic, but not all of it. But I do not want it to cost more for wildfire evacuees to rebuild. They've been through enough, and I don't think that we need to add the additional costs for them to rebuild back to where they were. And so I am interested in hearing ideas from people on how we can modify it so that we can ensure that fire victims are not penalized with additional costs to rebuild due to this code amendment. And if it's unable to be defensible by a category of fire victims, perhaps it could be defined by people rebuilding after a certain time period. After 3 years, it goes into effect, or something to that effect. Because the point made regarding additional cost to rebuild, I think, is a good point. So I'd be interested in hearing more thoughts from others about that. I do also think that it is important to define like no new subdivision or partial or partition should be allowed to create the potential for additional residential dwellings in the floodplain. I think that's important. I just don't want the people that are currently there and to be negatively affected. I really want this to be a code for from this period forward for new development. And with those thoughts, I'll leave it open for other commissioners to speak. And if there's no other ones of Commissioner Sorensen, I know Commissioner Bozovich had some more thoughts. Commissioner Sorensen.
I think we should let Jay go ahead of me, and then, or any other commissioner ahead of Jay, but then Jay, then me.
Okay, I'll choose Jay, and then if somebody else wants to raise their hand, we can go from there. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. So I'll get to some of my other concerns. I'm glad you feel the same way about adding that extra foot. And as you look at flood profiles for many other rivers in Lane County, main stem of the Willamette, Coast Fork, Isla, that difference between the 100 and 500 year can vary from less than a foot to as much as 5 feet. One of the things you have to understand is as flood elevations go up, it's almost like a logarithmic scale. So if you go between that 100 and 500 year, and there's 5 feet of difference between it, and you go up a foot, you're probably jumping up to somewhere around the 300 year storm, not necessarily up to the 500, but still, we're already 1 foot above. And when you get 2 feet above and we're halfway to the 500 year, there's significant difference in the years, the recurrence event that would actually reach that flood elevation. Once you're past the 100 year, you're at an occurrence that has, less than 0.1% chance of happening, in that year. So that's the reason it's referred to as the 100-year storm, although a lot of hydrologists hate that terminology because it's actually a probability. It's not an actual, it doesn't happen every 100 years. They can actually happen back to back. So just, I appreciate your thoughts on that. The problematic thing about exceptions is writing them in a way, like you said, that will actually be defensible and something that we can actually not have thrown out in a court hearing later on when somebody that has their house burned down because they left a pot on the kitchen stove overnight on the Isla floodplain want to get the same treatment as a fire victim from the Holiday Farm fire and goes to court to try and say that there's prejudice in our land use code because we're treating one fire victim different from another fire victim and allowing to rebuild under the old code. And that exception ends up getting tossed by the judge because it's prejudicial. And then the savings and severability clause that's on all of our land use actions would put people back to the whole code, because the exception would be what gets tossed out, not our entire code. So be very wary of writing exceptions. You know, that savings and severability clause and the fact that somebody might challenge the exception as being unfair and why weren't they included could actually get the entire exception thrown out. So just knowing that as you're trying to protect the fire victims, even our exception for floodway reconstruction for fire victims may be challengeable. I just want to make people aware of that. I also want to make people really aware of being careful about clear and objective language in land use code. And that's, I kind of supported staff pulling that higher ground provision out because it wasn't clear and objective. How easy is it for folks to challenge where practicable? And if our staff determines, you know, in a hearings official or even a planning director's decision that they've met that criteria, it's an easy thing for somebody, a third party, to appeal on. And, you know, appeals don't necessarily have to have merit, but they can cost an applicant a lot of money in defending those appeals and a lot of time. So clear and objective language is really important, which leads me to the language around critical facilities. And if we go, you know, to the actual language of the code, it's a facility that, for which even a slight chance of flooding might be too great. Now that's really subjective. You know, what is too great? And it says critical facilities include, but are not limited to, which means anybody can challenge that. You know, what's a critical facility? And it goes on to talk about, in addition to things like hospitals, you know, nursing homes, which, you know, if we want to list those things as considered critical facilities, we should list specific what is a critical facility and not have language that talks about, but not limited to language. We should list them, clear and objective. And it includes installations which produce, use, and store hazardous materials or hazardous waste. The problem with that is later on down we have a definition of hazardous materials, which includes references to EPA list, et cetera, et cetera. I've been to those lists, and there's common items like ammonia is considered a hazardous material. Doesn't say how many pounds you have to have in storage to be considered a critical facility. It just says hazardous material. So somewhere we need to either have a limitation on, you know, there's a reportable quantity that EPA has. We could make reference to storage of a reportable quantity, which for ammonia is 100 pounds, and not too many households store 100 pounds of ammonia. Or I forget how many pounds of 2,4-D, which is in Scott's turf builder, +2. You know, there are all sorts of common household items on that hazardous materials list. So you would be basically qualifying every house in Lane County as a critical facility as that language is written, which means now we're not just elevating an extra foot, but 2 feet above the floodplain. So we're now, you know, $10,000 to $20,000 in additional cost, plus the compensatory fill requirement. So I think there needs to be some additional work done on the language around critical facilities and hazardous materials. So at this point, I can't imagine approving this reading and going to a final reading. And if we're going to change language, I can't imagine us closing the public hearing. So there's definitely some work that needs to be done there. If we're going to try and bring back in a higher ground standard, it needs to be written in a clear and objective way. and so it's defensible and not overly challenged. And we also need to be really careful about our exceptions we're writing. This is like I said, a very complex piece of legislation that has impact on a lot of people in Lane County. I mean, you could probably ask staff, but the number of notices that were sent out as part of our Measure 56 notification, which by the way, is 9 months old at this point. So the original notification of property owners that were doing stuff that might infect them is 9 months ago. But it was thousands of notifications sent out. So we really should be careful about this and make sure we're not doing things just to look like we're protecting things when we're actually just adding cost, particularly when we're talking about cost of housing. And we should be very careful about clear and objective language and defensible exceptions.
Are there any other commissioners that haven't spoken that would like to speak? Commissioner Farr? We need your audio.
Thank you, Chair Buck. I do have a few questions, and I may have more questions once I've raised these. A question for staff is, it's been pointed out that Planning Commission has recommended that the compensatory storage language be removed from the ordinance. Can you talk about why the Planning Commission made such a recommendation?
Yes, of course. The Planning Commission, after review of that language, felt that it may be difficult to implement and it may be difficult for property owners to achieve compliance with that criteria. And ultimately, they saw the compensatory storage as being a way to limit the amount of fill being placed in the flood hazard area. And I believe that they had discussed other options to achieving that, mainly a no-rise analysis being required for when fill is placed in the flood hazard area. But ultimately, staff did keep that standard in the ordinance that came before the board because it was specifically requested by the board that the board wanted to see that compensatory storage language. And so we didn't want to remove it from the ordinance before the board had a chance to review it and deliberate on it.
Thank you. Regarding the no rise potential, the existing language on compensatory fill doesn't provide any provision for exceptions. For instance, if a facility can demonstrate that there is a no rise regarding the potential flood water, it's lumped in with everything else. And so we have kind of a one size fits all, I've heard it called.
Yes, there's.
I'm sorry, go ahead, keep talking, please. I'm having hardware issues.
There is one exception that was requested by Lane County Engineering and Construction Services because they do road projects in the floodplain that involve the placement of fill. They were interested in this provision, and preliminarily we worked with them. They do a no rise analysis anyways in most cases when they're doing a road project or a road overlay project that may require fill. So there is an exception in that compensatory storage standard that allows essentially allows for public roads to submit a no rise in lieu of doing the compensation.
So that's for public roads only, and not for roads that would access other facilities.
That's correct.
Okay. And why would we accept public facilities and public roads and not other roads? I mean, if a no rise analysis is completed and that demonstrates that there is no rise potential, why would we not allow that in private facilities also?
Again, this was a request from the board, so we did want to provide this language directly to you to deliberate on. I from a staff's opinion, I believe that the same effect could be achieved if anyone was allowed to submit a no rise in lieu of the compensatory storage language.
So the existing language does not allow that.
That's correct.
Okay, so I see a reason to adjust the language, which is tiny Roman numeral X, regarding compensatory fill. I think that the other issue that I have is that it really provides standards that are invariable, no matter what the application of a particular property. For instance, I've seen evidence of potential for flood, for 100 or 500-year flood events, providing a fish trap that does not allow for a return of the fish to the body of water that allows them to go to move back and forth to the ocean. So I think that I have some issues surrounding compensatory fill that go beyond the cost of the fill, but go actually into the application that could have unintended consequences that really are detrimental to what our goal is, which is providing fish habitat and allowing for the free passage and free movement of fish. And that's just one of the issues that I have with the compensatory fill. So I think there needs to be some more work done on that language. Chair Buck, I'll hold my discussion for a few moments, and I may come back to this after the board further discusses the issue.
Commissioner Burney.
There's so much here. It's hard to organize my thoughts. One of my thoughts is I can't believe how much Commissioner Bozovich likes this stuff. I remember a year and a half ago, you admitted this is the reason why you became a county commissioner. I'll just tag on to Commissioner Farr and then go to some other subjects. For me, first of all, I want to thank everyone that's presented on various perspectives of the issues that we're confronting. I really do. It's both educational and healthy to air this. It's ironic, I think, that this process began and then was interrupted by a fire, which has absolutely devastated lives, and yet, is impacted potentially by the discussion that we're having. So I appreciate that this Board of Commissioners has not only gone above and beyond and will continue to assist victims of that fire, most of whom are in Commissioner Buck's district, but also are committed to whatever rules we put in place. I would hope, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, that we hold harmless people that lost their homes to rebuild, and to do that as quickly and as cost effectively as possible. So having prefaced that, I appreciate Commissioner Bozovich's discussion about clear and objective, et cetera. And I want staff to know that I appreciate also the flood insurance cost impacts, but I also see this an opportunity to balance environmental concerns with the concerns of growth and development and do the right thing. So I have objective what the higher ground option is, and in fact, including that in a next version of what we look at, understanding and agreeing that we got to define our terms here. It also seems that might mitigate the extra costs for some homes that are being built in the floodplain. My understanding is that everyone is in agreement, and I know I'll learn soon enough if I'm wrong. Everyone is in agreement that we are prohibiting the building of any additional residences in the floodway. I don't believe that is the issue here. And I also believe that anything we can do, as Chair Buck said, moving forward, you know, knowing that we have to create an exception, which Commissioner Vozovich warned us against, but an exception for victims of the fire. But moving forward, anything we can do to mitigate loss of life and health and property is incumbent upon us to do. So I don't have all my notes, but I know that a woman named, I know that the discussion of septic fields and chemicals and the storage of fuels and, you know, and all of that stuff, the notion that that go above the floodplain to higher ground, I see as just common sense. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I see. So I want to provide that input. I think environmentally we have to do what's right. I also saw that article, by the way, in the Salem paper about the DEQ tests on water, which really surprised me. I didn't anticipate reading that, and to see that that was a 4-year-old study means that we do have to be concerned about chemicals and toxins, et cetera, in our water supply. So having said all of that, I simply want to say I think it's too early to close the public hearing, as was recommended. I think that it's premature until we explore some of these areas in greater depth. I want to get to all of my environmental concerns. I'm not saying I will. And I want Commissioner Vozovich to say that's clear enough and objective enough. I can go along with that. So I propose that we continue on. And I really want to learn more about this whole compensatory storage issue, because if staff says that there's a way around that which accommodates the same desire, I don't see why we don't go that way. I think you talked about no rise. So anyway, I'm sorry if that was not as cogent as normal, but those are my remarks for now. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you. I thought I would take a shot at a motion, bearing in mind the comments that have been made by the commissioners. I wanted to make a motion to approve the fourth reading of ordinance number 20-08, set the fifth reading and continue the public hearing to December 1, 2020, and to direct staff to prepare language using the Deschutes Code for specific, as specific as possible, language that rebuilding in the floodway has to be on higher ground, that building in the floodplain, if it's possible to make it clear that its objective standards has to be on higher ground. And finally, that no subdivisions will be allowed in, no new subdivisions will be in the floodplain, again, using the Deschutes County language to the extent possible. And I make this motion in the hopes that we can, A, keep this moving, and also that we will have continued staff work leading to the additional public hearing, so people will have an opportunity to review the language that staff includes. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner Sorensen, second by Commissioner Burney. Now it's time for some discussion. Are there any comments, remarks? Commissioner Farr and then Commissioner Vozovich.
Thank you, Chair Buck, and I'm having some audio connectivity issues, so I may be interrupted in my discussion. I'm certainly in favor of moving to a fifth reading, and you know, the Deschutes County provisions are certainly something that could be discussed and implemented, because I think, as Commissioner Burney pointed out, we all agree that no net new dwellings in the floodway are what we intend. And as pointed out by many of the people who provided public testimony, we don't want stuff washing downstream that's going to affect people in. I'm being very colloquial with that. We don't want stuff washing downstream that's going to affect people down in a negative way downstream. That's a very simple way of stating that we need to address everything that we can in the floodway to make certain that we're not providing net damage downstream. That being said, having a single set of rules, particularly as we've talked about with compensatory storage, that doesn't allow for any flexibility in perpetuity, is going to be has a potential negative impact on the things that we do need to do and can do without really significantly affecting what may be washed downstream. Paying particular attention to the passage of fish, for instance, and paying particular attention to the fact that we don't want to landlock fish, and that we can provide some roads and other facilities without a net, following a net no rise analysis that we can provide, that we can actually allow for provision of such facilities. I think more discussion has to be had on that. So in going forward with a fifth reading, I think that we need to include a discussion on compensatory storage, and make certain that we are able to address some of the issues that potentially we could achieve the ends that we wish without a binding set of rules that does not allow for any flexibility.
Thank you. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. The motion specifically addressed the issue of higher ground for floodway and floodplain, and wanting to get some kind of clear and objective standard for that, which I appreciate. And starting with the language that Deschutes County has, which is not necessarily clear and objective. So that's fine. The portion that talks about no new subdivisions in floodplain or floodway, I'm not quite sure how that works out, because there could be subdivisions that have some floodplain encroaching on them. And I'm not sure, if there's a large parcel of land that somebody's trying to subdivide and there's an acre of floodplain on it, does that mean they're not allowed to subdivide that property? That provision needs a little bit more clarification before I can really support it. And the motion does not address the issue of trying to get to clear and objective standards for critical facilities, and what hazardous waste and materials storage really means, and not trying to catch every little residence or with that. So I would like to move to amend the motion to also direct staff to provide revised language for the definition of critical facilities and hazardous materials that's clear and objective, and meets the intent of trying to keep those listed critical facilities out of the floodplain and floodway, as well as large quantities of hazardous materials that would generally be connected to commercial, industrial, or maybe even farm use out of the floodplain and floodway, and not try and catch every. I don't want to go on much further than that, but the idea is to try and prevent homeowners. So if I could move to amend the motion to include correcting language for the next reading around the critical facilities, as well as correcting the date of the actual Holiday Farm fire in that one place where it mentions the date.
I'll ask the maker if that's considered a friendly before we ask for a second.
No, it can't be, and I'll just leave it there for now.
Second. So the maker, Commissioner Bernie.
I believe I seconded Commissioner Sorensen's motion. So I just wanted to ask Commissioner Sorensen, if you don't mind, why that you don't consider that friendly?
Because I think it's important that we have the existing language in there. I think if we hear public comment on our proposal as staff drafts it, then obviously this issue can be raised at that time. But I kind of feel like it's important to keep these kinds of chemicals out of the floodplain and floodway. And so I don't agree that we should, amend this. If after we get a public hearing and there's some testimony on Commissioner Bozovich's proposal, then I guess I'd be, inclined to support a friendly amendment then. But we haven't had any testimony on this topic. We didn't have any today.
Yes, we did.
We didn't have enough that I heard myself, but it may well be we had some testimony on the topic.
Thank you, Commissioner. I just wanted to understand the thinking.
Commissioner Bosevich.
Sorry, I didn't realize I still had my mic open. I apologize for that. Mr. Gillard testified twice now to us about the language under critical facilities being unclear. So I just want to make that clear. It was also brought up at the Planning Commission by several people that it was a concern. And I've brought it up specifically now a couple times. But we have had testimony about the lack of clarity there. I don't want to punish somebody for having a bottle of Mr. Clean in their cabinet. And that makes them a critical facility. As our current language is written, that would make you a critical facility if you had a bottle of Mr. Clean underneath your sink in the kitchen. And I just don't think that that's what we intended by trying to write that language in and try and prevent, those facilities from being in the floodway or floodplain, not just somebody that happens to have some cleaner underneath their sink in their kitchen.
Thank you.
And Chair Buckhead, second, I'd like to speak to the motion.
Sure. If I may just add a thought. I actually considered that amendment friendly, and I'm just hoping that the maker would reconsider. Commissioner Farr.
And maybe this would help. The reason I seconded this is because of just because of the amount of of potentially dangerous or hazardous materials. It's not specific regarding whether it's 1 ounce or 10 pounds, or in the case of ammonia, as Commissioner Bozovich pointed out earlier, there are standards which allow for 100 pounds, up to 100 pounds of ammonia. So a particular set of standards that defines what the threshold for a substance being considered a hazardous substance. I'm sitting within 50 feet, probably 10 feet of items that would qualify my house under this definition as a critical facility, because I have window cleaner in my house. I also have some, I don't have Scott's Surf Builder +2. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I thought so. It's Scott's Turf Builder +2. So, I think if we had some definition regarding what the threshold was for hazardous materials, then I'd be satisfied with that. And I would hope that it would qualify under that circumstance as a friendly amendment. But my second hold, should it not qualify as a friendly?
Commissioner Sorensen and then Commissioner Brady.
Well, let me ask you this. Are we trying to limit the amount of hazardous materials that are beyond what is a residential internal to a person's home? I mean, I haven't heard that. And if that could be part of a amendment to improve my motion, I'd be happy to support it. But I'm not hearing anything specific. Like, Jay's holding up his cell phone. If you're trying to say that your amendment would ban people from having cell phones, I'm against that. I'm against that kind of limitation, because that seems extreme to me, but I'm not quite sure what you want to do here. And that is, if you want to do something that you can explain directly that protects the river and protects the people that have normal things in their homes. I'm talking about big impacts, things that are going to affect the river. And we do not want that in such a critical location as a floodplain in Lane County. There are many people that get their drinking water out of these rivers. They need these rivers to be clean, and this is an incremental step to doing that. I'm certainly open to an improvement to my motion and to the underlying, ordinance that would clarify what is or is not allowed. But I'm not quite sure if your motion is interpreted to do that, and it's low and it's to protect the river. I'm all in favor of it. And to that extent, it could be viewed as friendly. But the way it was framed was you want to have clarity, but it didn't say how you wanted to have the clarity.
Commissioner Burney.
Here's what I think. I think that we're going to ultimately have a much cleaner and more environmentally sane policy ultimately. All I heard, I think clarity, in fact, that's all I heard. Clarity, and I'm speaking for you, Commissioner Bozovich. I know better than that. I apologize. But the reason I asked why you thought originally that it was unfriendly was because I think we're going to arrive there anyway. We have to. We have to arrive at what levels are acceptable and what are not. And by the way, I would like to make a statement for everyone. I have no Mr. Clean in my cabinets, and I don't even know what it is. You must be way older than me. But anyway, so we're going to arrive at clarity. That clarity is going to be environmentally defensible, and that clarity is not going to punish households that have small amounts of cleaners in them. And what I heard was not Commissioner Bozovich saying what it had to be or trying to sideswipe the intent of the motion. What I heard was he asked staff to come back with that clarity.
If that's the case, I would consider it friendly, but I want to make it clear that it's to ask staff to come back, and that is the part that would allow them to listen to the board and decide whether or not we want to have lax standards or strong standards to protect water quality.
Commissioner Bozovich, would you like to restate?
Yeah, the first words of my motion were to direct staff to provide new language to be more clear and objective for critical facilities and the hazardous materials. Leaving staff to try and figure out the best way to write those clear and objective standards around that. Right now, as it stands, there is no lower limit. So your cell phone that has, heavy metals in it would be considered hazardous material and would make your household become a critical facility for just having your cell phone in it. That's not what I want to have this do. I just want to have us staff come back with language that has something that we can at least discuss. Right now, there is no lower limit, and the language is unclear. It also includes that language around, not limited to the list. And I think we need to have a limited list of what a critical facility is, because that not limited to language will allow for a lot of appeals of facilities claiming we should have considered that a critical facility. So, we should be able to decide now what critical facilities are that should be included in this language, rather than having this nebulous not limited to clause in there, which will open up every floodplain development, including fire reconstruction, for households to appeal. I just want to have clear and objective language.
Before I call on him, Commissioner Sorensen, Commissioner Bozovich, could you restate the amendment that you were proposing for clarity?
In addition to the motion to approve the fourth reading and set fifth reading and the language around higher ground and subdivisions, to add to direct staff to come back with language that changes the definition of critical facilities and hazardous materials to be clear and objective.
I'll ask the maker, Commissioner Sorensen.
Yeah, I consider that a friendly amendment to the motion I made earlier.
Is there a second to the amendment?
Second.
If it's a friendly, does it need a second?
You're right. Actually, you're right. Doesn't need one.
Darn, I wanted to second it.
The seconder of the original motion has to agree, Joe, so that could cover your needs there.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, it does.
Okay, very good. So we have a motion plus the amendment. Final discussion, Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. And as the motion is stated, I'm prepared to support it. I would like to also suggest a second amendment to direct staff to add a no-rise analysis clause for private and public facilities.
I'll again ask the maker if that's considered a friendly.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, from both. So we have two amendments, the original motion and two amendments. Any final discussion? Commissioner Bozovich.
So I just want to note, Chair Buck, sorry, that your discussion earlier about exemption of the additional foot of freeboard for fire victims is not part of this motion. So if you want to try and craft maybe another friendly amendment around that, we're still talking about adding an extra foot of freeboard for the reconstruction of anyone that's in either floodway or floodplain that's a Holiday Farm fire victim rebuilding, if this passes before they reconstruct.
I appreciate that. I was actually getting to that particular point. I, as chair, cannot make a motion, but would highly recommend to the rest of the commissioners if they would consider that additional option for this motion so that we can come to the December meeting with all these ideas combined. Commissioner Sorensen.
I have no objection to having that as part of the original motion.
Are you looking at me, Chair?
Yes.
I have no objection to that either.
Okay, so this is our challenge. And we need to restate the entire motion with the amendments before we vote. So I'm going to attempt to do this unless Commissioner Sorensen would like to do that.
My suggestion was that each of the people who made the motion, me, and made suggestions for friendly amendments, each of us state what our component parts of this motion are.
I think that would be wise, but I will need somebody to also add in the exemption for the Holiday Farm fire victims, because I, as chair, can't do that. I will start with you, Commissioner Sorensen, and then I'll move to Commissioner Bozovich and then Commissioner Farr.
Yeah. I made a motion to approve the fourth reading of the ordinance, and I'll get that number here. Move approval of the fourth reading of ordinance number 20-08, set the fifth reading and continue the public hearing to December 1, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. And to direct staff, and there are 3 items on my list. There are other items on other commissioners' lists. One, that we ban the construction of dwellings in the floodway. And if there's rebuilding in the floodway, it has to be at a higher ground if it can be, if standards can be set for that, such as in the Deschutes County Code. 2, that new floodplain building has to occur if it's possible, and again, according to Deschutes County Ordinance, on higher ground. And finally, no new subdivisions in the floodplain, again, with reference to Deschutes Code. And then there were several other parts of the motion that other commissioners can enumerate.
I'll move to Commissioner Bozovich to add to that clarity of the motion.
So I asked to add a rewrite of the definition of critical facilities and hazardous materials, those 2 definitions, to be clear and objective as to what they are, and not open-ended with the the language that basically not limited to language removed, and also the hazardous materials having some kind of thresholds written into that. In addition to that, I will add that there is a desire to have an exception written for Holiday Farm fire victims from the new additional foot of freeboard requirements contained in this code when they reconstruct from the Holiday Farm fire.
Thank you, Commissioner Farr, for the final portion of the motion.
Thank you. Would be to direct staff to include under item 5A, Roman numeral 10, to include language surrounding a no-rise analysis and possible exception on public and private facilities.
Okay, everybody, this was the full motion, and that was, I just want to clarify, the second, Commissioner Burney, that's what you heard as well?
That is what I heard as well, and I'm very comfortable with this motion. Thank you.
Very good. So if there's no further discussion, I'll call for a vote on that entire motion. All those in favor, please say, oh, this is an ordinance.
This is just the 4th reading, not the approval.
Okay.
So,
I just want to be careful because I always mess that up.
Now, Chair, you got to get this right once.
All right. So if that's the entirety of the motion, clarifying we don't need a roll call. All right. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everybody. We're getting there.
I think I will sleep well tonight now.
Okay, we'll move to commissioners' business. Do commissioners have any announcements? All right, I see none. Any future board assignment requests? I see none there. Review of assignments.
Well, I'm not going to review the motion you just gave, because I think you took time, thank you, and you made that abundantly clear. So we have that. Otherwise, I didn't have any other assignments on the list from today.
Very good. So at this time, I'm going to read us into executive session. And given the time, it is 3:44. I will read us into executive session. We can meet at 3:50 on the executive session's website. So we are moving into executive session for Tuesday, November 10th, 2020. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to deliberate with persons designated by the governing body to negotiate real property transactions and to consult with counsel concerning legal rights and duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation likely to be filed. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.660, subsection 2, subsection E and H, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. We reserve the right to come back out into public session should the need arise. I do not see that need to arise at this point, but we reserve that right. Thank you, everybody, and we'll meet in executive session in 5 minutes.